Today's workshop, organized by the Florence School of Regulation Climate as part of the LifeSite project, is about the impact of the EU emission trading system on low-carbon innovation and investment. About 25 people are participating, including analysts from the universities and other research institutions, policymakers and representatives of the regulated industries and NGOs. My contribution consists in providing a context for the subsequent presentations and the discussion, firstly by summarizing the evidence emerging from empirical literature, and secondly by indicating some of the questions that should be addressed in the workshop. While of course effects are heterogeneous across sectors and firms, there is robust evidence that the EU ETS has been internalized by the regulated firms with an impact on their organization and operation. The EU ETS has also induced fuel switching and small-scale investment in emission efficiency. The low level of the carbon price and regulatory uncertainty are generally indicated as the main factors preventing more substantial effects.
So what our research that we conducted at the London School of Economics has shown is that the introduction of the EU ETS, the European Carbon Market, had a very large effect on innovation in low-carbon technologies by companies that were regulated by the European Carbon Market. And what is more, this positive effect on low-carbon patenting activity happened in 2008 and 2009, just at the time when the price on the European market was high at about 30 euros a ton, and when market players expected this price to remain high in the future, because it's really expectations about future prices that matter. And so what this research really shows is that the current price in the EU ETS at around 5 euros a ton is really too low to lead to any innovation activity in low carbon technologies at the moment. So we need higher prices. The second thing that our research showed is that having a carbon price is nice. It's very important, but it needs to be complemented with specific technology support policies that directly target research and development activities conducted by these companies. And to the second message from the presentation I gave this morning is that what we need is also more support to innovation through European funds to support the development of low-carbon technologies.
When we look back at the European Emissions Trading Scheme, it has been a great introduction into the year 2005 and contributed to momentum in climate policy and was perceived as an important element of national and increasing global climate policy. In Paris, we now found new momentum on international climate policy, in particularly focusing both on the responsibility of producers and on the responsibility of consumers. What we've been looking at with our institution was at the case of basic materials, steel, cement, and aluminium, 16% of greenhouse gas emissions in Europe. For these materials to be effectively covered by ETS, we do need to complement the upstream system, ETS, with a consumption charge for these materials. Putting this in together for the period post-2020 will be an essential improvement of ETS so as to facilitate the transformation of some of our most basic industries. And it is something that in similar dimensions is discussed in other regions of the world. So it's a step forward in global climate policy and a step which we are discussing today as well.
So in my presentation, I first spoke about what we call effective carbon rates. Effective carbon rates are the sum of carbon taxes, excise taxes on energy use, and prices from emission trading permits. We take the sum of these three components. We call this the effective carbon rate. This is the total price for carbon emissions that energy users now pay. These effective carbon rates change the relative price of energy use. We calculated these effective carbon rates for 41 countries, OECD countries and G20 countries, all except one. And what we find is that these effective carbon rates very often are well below 30 euros, which is kind of a low-end estimate of the climate damage from a ton of emissions. So often well below 30 euros per ton. In 60% of the cases for the emissions, the rate is zero. For 90% of emissions, the rate is actually below 30 euros per ton. So that's a first insight, and then we also calculate the contribution that emission trading systems make to these effective carbon rates. That contribution at this point is actually quite limited. The coverage of emission trading systems is relatively narrow, and the price levels where emission trading systems exist is quite low. And this is just to give a little bit of perspective to the discussion which we have today on the role of emission trading systems. So there is potential, but the potential is not yet being realized. Then I also developed kind of a newer insight in 2 words. The insight there is that free allocation of permits arguably reduces the incentives to invest in low carbon assets. And I gave some examples of permit allocation rules both in the California Cap and Trade program and in the EU ETS system that illustrates that average effective carbon rates very often are much lower than marginal effective carbon rates, and we argue that this tends to weaken the incentive to invest in long-run low-carbon assets.
This second workshop is timely done for the chemical industry. We're just about to publish a study commissioned with DECEMA on how the chemical industry could eventually turn carbon neutral by 2050. Another one was published by Accenture, taking the chemical industry into circularity. Those 2 concepts are actually fundamental going forward into the innovation portfolio of the chemical industry, but also leaning towards the value chains, particularly transport and building, where we think the most leveraging potential for chemical products still lies. So, good news to be here, and we have delivered those messages to the rest of the team.
So, in my opinion, despite having been running for more than 10 years now, the EU ETS is a very young policy tool. I believe also that the experience we have with this instrument is very limited because for many years the circumstances has been completely unexpected. I'm referring to the deep economical crisis, the decrease of the industrial activity, the financial difficulties also that the companies are realizing even now. And all this makes, from my point of view, very difficult to make an assessment in the sense that to what extent really this instrument is working well. So my main point is that we had to try to avoid make an assessment based on these extraordinary circumstances and really focus on the future and see whether or not in a normal scenario this instrument will provide what we want from it in terms of driving investments to low carbon economy.
My main point today is that the emissions trading system will need to become part of a larger industrial strategy for Europe with innovation at its core. The challenge for, in particular, energy-intensive industries is significant. They will have to reduce emissions by 80 to 95% over the next 30 years. For them, that's basically one investment cycle away. This is such a big effort that a carbon price on its own will not be able to succeed or make these industries succeed. Therefore, we need a broader agenda that needs more European and national instruments that enables these industries to both reduce emissions but stay competitive at the same time. And that will require major investments in new processes, breakthrough technologies, but also new products that match the demands of a low-carbon society. And finally, new business models that will link different industries together, where a waste product of one industry can become the resource of another energy-intensive industry. It's only when we bring these things together that we will be able to successfully decarbonize European industry and keep them competitive.
Hi, I'm Koen from Eurelectric, and my message today is that we as European power sector, we are committed to delivering a carbon neutral power supply by 2050. And we're also committed to bringing low carbon solutions to the market. I think the EU ETS can indeed become a main driver for investments in low carbon electricity generation. However, as it stands today, the EU ETS is not doing that. It is not giving the incentive for investors to invest in low carbon solutions. So we as Eurelectric, we see a strengthening of the EU ETS as a no regret. In order to give to investors the short and long-term signals they expect, we see two measures as necessary. One is the strengthening of the MSR, and there we are looking at an increased uptake rate to 24%. A second measure is increasing the linear reduction factor to at least 2.4% to bring the EU ETS in line with the agreed Paris objectives. So as we are committed to become carbon neutral by 2050, we see huge potential to also cost-effectively drive out emissions in other sectors by taking up electricity. And namely, we are looking here at an increased electrification of the transport sector and the heating and cooling sector.
Today's event is coming at a very topical timing. We're talking about ETS reform, we're talking about investments, we're talking about innovation. The timing is just perfect for a sector like ours, CEPI, European Pulp and Paper Industry, where we've been just releasing a few weeks ago our Review 2050 roadmap, where we've been looking again at how can we achieve the 2050 objective of reducing carbon emissions by 80% while increasing our added value by 50%. In terms of practical ways forward, clearly we are coming at a timing where investments is absolutely needed in Europe and especially needed in industry. And that's where the combination of policy measures that needs to be fit into the ETS also needs to match the overall environment settings of bringing investments in Europe. The ETS review brings a positive element because with the changes that are expected to come, the regulatory risk is quite reduced, and this is, I think, positive. Then there is an issue with creating more access to innovation through the Innovation Fund open to industry. This is a great opportunity to bring technologies in the market. And then there is a third dimension which is still needs to be addressed, and that is how are we going to value low carbon products? How are customers going to choose the right low carbon products? And here we are kind of still missing in policy measures. We need regulation, we need incentives, we need public administration to do the job. And I think if you combine all this together, we manage to create new added value that will be then used to create cash for decarbonization.
So we're here today to discuss the reform of the European emissions trading system and how it can contribute to low carbon investments and innovation. And this is also for WWF a very important issue because it actually defines how we use pollution pricing in Europe to contribute to more renewable energy deployment and energy savings throughout Europe. The ETS has huge potential there, but because of the depressingly low carbon price, it doesn't deliver its current potential. So we need to ensure that there's a higher price on carbon pollution in Europe, that more emission allowances are auctioned, and as a consequence that we can reinvest these auction allowances into cleaner ways of producing goods and energy in Europe. We see great potential there, but there's a lot of work to be done.